Well, welcome everyone to our October session of Reading Pilgrimage Together. We shifted it a little bit to take advantage of the fact that the folks in the UK have a school holiday last week, or had a school holiday last week, or many of them did. We'll be talking today about Clear Horizon. And let me just start with the usual administrative remarks. So this is Reading Pilgrimage Together for November. We, until Elon Musk destroys Twitter, will continue to share thoughts and quotes and reactions through the Pilgrimage Together hashtag. Hopefully you're continuing to find the material on the Reading Pilgrimage site useful in going through. So we are now down in the final stretch. You can see we've got just after Clear Horizon, we've got about 150 some pages left of this amazing book. Max Saunders has very kindly agreed to join us for this session. Next month, we'll be talking about Dimple Hill with Dr. Annika Lindskog from Sweden. And then in January, we're going to be talking about the last book, March Moonlight, but also kind of doing a wrap up of the book in general. So I have already sent out an invitation to all of our special guests, and several of them have replied saying they're planning to join us already. So hopefully that'll be a nice opportunity. Everybody will, I hope, have digested the book, gone through and had a week or two to reflect back on it, and that we can kind of share our reactions about what this experience has been. I also wanted to let everybody know about a bit of news. Last week, Scott McCracken and I recorded a session of the Lost Ladies of Lit podcast that focused on Dawn's Left Hand. And it was really funny because both Kim and Amy, who are the hosts of the show, said that when they started Dawn's, they're coming to Pilgrimage cold. So I recommended Dawn's Left Hand because I felt that it was kind of getting Pilgrimage in media res, so to speak. And both of them said after about the first chapter, they wanted to send me a hate-filled email with all of their, they felt like I'd left them at the base of Everest, with a little pickaxe and some raisins. But by the end of it, they not only loved the book, but both of them said they're going back to Pointed Roofs and they're going to start and go through the whole series. So I think we had a couple of converts out of that. I don't have a date for that, but as soon as I know, I'll let everybody know on Twitter. So, oops, yeah. I'm sorry, I haven't changed this. So we're talking about Clear Horizon, even though I haven't changed the slide. I've got the book cover. This was the last book that was published as a separate volume. So this is the last time Richardson got individual volume reviews. And this book also, like Dawn's Left Hand, only came out in the UK. So there will be reviews posted, but you'll see that they're only from a few of the UK magazines. And joining us today, we have Max Saunders, who has an amazing CV. If you are a lover of Ford, Maddox Ford, like I am, Max, I think, still has the authoritative biography of Ford, which is an amazing book, and continues to explore topics well beyond just the traditional modernist kind of spheres of interest. So we're very lucky to have Max with us today. And without further ado, let's get to the good part. So welcome, Max. And if I can just find you here, there we go. Okay, welcome, Max. And as usual, you know what the scheme is here. If you would like to take a few minutes to offer some thoughts and comments on the book, on pilgrimage in general, and then we'll open it up for a discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much, Brad, and welcome to everyone this evening. Couple of sort of apologies before I start. One is that I'm not at all a Richardson expert, and I am very much enjoying this group. I'd not got to the end of pilgrimage before, I have to confess. I have very high hopes of making it this time round. We're so near the end, and it's been a really wonderful experience. The other apology is that my internet connection just crashed a couple of minutes ago. I hope it's not going to do it again, but if it does, please talk amongst yourselves till I get back again. And what I'm going to do is, as Brad said, is say a few words, but I'm very happy to be interrupted at any point. So do chip in if you want to stop me, tell me I'm wrong, or ask a question or anything like that. So Clear Horizon opens with Miriam rather uncharacteristically, I think, missing someone's company. Not either of the lovers she's acquired in the previous book, but someone called Lionel Chumley, a fellow boarder and also a poet. If we're surprised for a moment to read she was almost yearning for him, we're soon back to the solitary Miriam we've come to know and love when Richardson writes that she was almost willing to sacrifice breakfast time solitude for the sake of his presence. Not quite, just almost. Mm-hmm. We've noticed those shifts between first and third person in the book before. And I think it's very telling that that happens in this opening scene as well. And I think it sheds a different kind of light on why she's using that technique. The story opens in the third person, then switches into the first person and then back to the third. And where the switch happens the first time is with the phrase about Chumley, his eyes met mine. And the mine is the kind of signaling of the first person arriving. As if being sort of switched into a personal relationship with someone makes her feel subjective suddenly. And then at the end of the scene, it's when she bade farewell that releases her back into objectivity. So the bit that goes into the first person is just when she's talking to Chumley. But that's sort of released back into objectivity is the state that solitude allows, and in which she generally tends to feel freer and happier, I think. And it seems a good moment to start, because in a way Clear Horizon is a book or a novel of bidding farewell to different people, or perhaps I should say another novel of bidding farewell. We've seen how in earlier volumes Miriam renounces others, whether romantic possibilities like Densley, the doctor, or Michael Shattoff, or friends or flatmates like Selina Holland. And in Dawn's Left Hand, we saw the start of her affairs with Hypo Wilson and with Amabel. But in Clear Horizon, it's their turn to be chucked, as Hypo puts it. She also decides to take a break from her work towards the end of the book. So it's also goodbye for at least some time to the Orleys and Mr. Hancock, her dentist employers. So Clear Horizons as a title, thus to that extent, is about freeing herself from even the closest ties, her two lovers, her work, having a sense of open possibility without limits, cleared of obstructions. Then there's a really extraordinary passage a few pages in, which is rather unlike the rest of the sequence, at least so far, and which Brad drew attention to in a tweet, saying Miriam levitates, and saying he was surprised no one had talked about it yet. So obviously that was my cue to draw our attention to it today. And I wonder if someone else would like to volunteer to read that out. This is page 279, passage he put on the Reading Pilgrimage site as well, beginning with a single upswinging movement. Do we have a volunteer reader, please? I say volunteer.
I can.
Okay, thanks very much.
Before we begin, can you tell me what chapter the passage is in? because I'm doing it on a Kindle and
Right.
Chapter 1.
It's in chapter 1. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So just a couple of paragraphs beginning with a single upswinging movement.
With a single upswinging movement, she was clear of earth and hanging, suspended and motionless high in the sky, looking away to the right into a far-off pearly blue distance. Oh gosh, my dog's gonna bark. Sorry, I think I'm gonna have to beg off because he's not gonna stop.
Not a Richardson lover, clearly.
Yes, and she wouldn't like him either.
Will somebody else jump in?
I will.
Okay.
Okay. With a single upswinging movement, she was clear of earth and hanging, suspended and motionless high in the sky. Looking away to the right into a far-off pearly blue distance that held her eyes, seeming to be in motion within itself, an intense crystalline vibration that seemed to be aware of being enchantedly observed, and even to be amused and to be saying, "Yes, this is my reality." She was moving, or the sky about her was moving. Masses of pinnacled clouds rose between her and the clear distances, and just as she felt herself sinking, her spirit seemed to be up amongst their high rejoicing summits. And then the little manageress was setting down the coffee upon the near table, her head turned, while still her fingers held the rim of the saucer in the direction of her next destination, towards which her kind, tired eyes were sending their quizzical smile. Joy that up there had seemed everywhere, pulsed now, confined within her, holding away thoughts, holding away everything but itself.
Fantastic, thanks very much. Would anyone like to comment on that? I mean, it is a really striking moment, isn't it?
Well, I did like how it continues. She seems to once in a while sort of drop just a little bit of naturalism in after she's done these incredibly, fantastical, acrobatical, astronomical journeys. And so the little manageress, and I'm not sure if it's before or after this passage. Oh yes, above the passage is she's edging sideways along the narrow gangway with her swab. It's earlier, I thought it was Dorothy's way of kind of tweaking us and sort of jerking a little back. I'm here, I'm there, but I'm gone again. But now I think she's feeling like she can see both things at once. It seems different to me now. So,
yeah, no, that's great. I think that's absolutely right, because this is intensely real, isn't it? This moment for her, and she gets, as Brad said in his tweet, I think, very frustrated with other people, or even the thought of other people not taking it seriously, treating it just as a metaphor for something else. First of all, it's introduced as a prelude to, quote, a serene and powerful realization of the being of spring. But it seems more than that, doesn't it? It's a strange moment of being up in the rejoicing sky for 2-3 seconds. That's all another quote. So it seems to be a paranormal experience, or what sometimes is described as an out-of-body experience, phenomenon where someone perceives the world from a location outside their physical body. She's not actually up in the clouds, but she feels that's what she's seeing. And I was reading up about this a little bit. Apparently 1 in 10 people has an out-of-body experience once, or more commonly several times in their life. I'm afraid the nearest I ever get is being on Zoom, but it is quite common, and Karen has just said in the chat, it's like a sort of Eastern description of self-realization. I think that's a good call, and I was wondering about the term horizon in the title. What a clear horizon is, what she means by that, and it's one thing it made me think of was the film Lost Horizon, which came out a couple of years before this book, I think, the Shangri-La story. She mentions Lhasa, doesn't she, in Clear Horizon at one point, but that sense of sort of being up in the clouds or up in the mountains away from everything else.
Well, one thought I have about this, Max, and I think it ties back to Oberlin, which is, and this is something I found myself returning to the American West after living in England and living in Belgium, which are two places where, and London is like this, you don't really see the horizon in those spaces. Really only when you go to the seashore in a few places in England do you see significant distances. And when she goes to the Alps in Oberland, I mean, she has the physical, the visual and physical reality of being able to see at significant distances. And I think that correlates kind of metaphorically to the sense of perspective on one's life that Miriam is going through kind of in this book.
Yeah, no, I agree. And there's some great comments in the chat about, how sort of meta these passages are, that it's concerned with her writing as well. And I absolutely agree with that. And it does connect with Oberland, doesn't it? The pinnacled clouds sort of summons up the mountains, I think, there.
Also, one other thing about the Clear Horizon, everyone's finished this book, right? So the last word is wayfaring. And that's really you're heading out onto the horizon, which got me thinking that why did she only write a couple more volumes? But we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
I'd like to add that I think this is about her writing when she's talking about floating among the clouds. I put a little bit in the chat about that, but she literally talks about writing on the very next page, and she talks about, getting things down. And I think that this is, well, I said on Twitter that it was like a transcendental experience, but I do think that she is experiencing something physical out of the experience of nailing something down on the page. And those of us who attempt to do that know what that is.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, one of the things I found out about out-of-body experiences is that there is another sort of aspect to the standard definition, which seems really pertinent to this, that they considered a form of something called autoscopy, or literally seeing the self. So the idea, it's not just that you go out of your body and you see somewhere else, like the top of the clouds or the mountaintops or whatever it is, but that you see yourself seeing them, and that's very interesting. And that is absolutely what she's doing in the writing of Pilgrimage, isn't it? I mean, we've commented before on this sort of curious movement, which is both inner and outer, sort of trying to see the subjectivity in an objective way. And so I do think it is a sort of meta moment as well.
It also seems to be, if I may add, perhaps her first positive feeling about writing. She feels very comfortable in writing at this point. And there's another passage later on that I think alludes to the fact that she may in fact be keeping a journal that we have never found, that we don't know really exists, but it does sound like that. She talks about having nailed down ideas that she had discussed with Michael. So anyway, yeah.
About that.
It does, to me, it raises the question that she's clearly writing, but it's not clear, other than occasionally there are references to reviews, it's not clear what she's writing.
Yeah.
So I think that, lends some, at least it lends some possibility to the idea that that's what she's doing, is writing in a journal or a diary of some type.
That's true, yes.
Or possibly in that letter to Hypo that she's writing or thinking about writing during this chapter.
Also, in terms of that autoscopy, was that the word?
Yeah.
Seeing yourself. I mean, to me, that I'm constantly throughout all these is that I'm thinking how old her character is, who she is invoking based on some of her own experiences, maybe not completely autobiographically, and how old the writer is when writing about this character. And I always feel as if there's a loop going on in her head. It has to be, to keep that focus on that, but things, sometimes they slip out. She even mentioned Wells's name this time, which I thought wasn't quite sure whether that was just a mistake or something else.
It's partly an insurance policy against people assuming that hypo is Wells, isn't it? But,
oh yes, right, of course.
Also there,
Oh, that's interesting.
And also George Calvin Shaw, who I have to admit, the first time I read this, I looked up who the heck George Calvin Shaw was, not recognizing it was Richardson's jab at George Bernard Shaw.
No, that's right. I mean, I think because Shaw was such a leading figure in the Fabians, right, people would have spotted that was him. But it is curious the way she does that.
There's also much more of a sense of contemporary events in this book compared to others, because we have the suffragette movement, even though for those who are interested, I may post this, but George Thompson does a careful analysis of the timing of events and essentially argues that Richardson's transposed suffragette march from the year before to the large suffragette march on the Houses of Parliament that is kind of was kind of the big publicity event for the movement, that actually Veronica Leslie Jones couldn't possibly have taken part in that better known event. And so Richardson kind of plays with fact and fiction in that treatment of that event.
Yeah, so someone just now, I think it was Phyllis, was it? I couldn't catch who, but mentioned the idea of a loop of time. And that's actually a phrase that comes up in the book, isn't it? When she's thinking about the experience in the concert, I think. So again, I do agree that sort of, the loop in the writing from the writing self in the present back to the past self she's writing about is absolutely kind of implied by these thoughts about the self and writing here. I thought, I mean, one of the other things that I found really fascinating, I mean, this is, I'm afraid, me getting on my future hobby horse again, sort of having introduced the idea of time, saying that I've been finding it really interesting, the attention Richardson gives to the idea of the future, and this novel is no exception. The presence of hypo, of course, is one factor. H.G. Wells had come to embody the future for many people, not just his science fiction like The Time Machine, but his speculative non-fiction like books like Anticipations. But it's also Miriam's attendance at the meetings of the Lycurgans based on the Fabians, committed to working for a progressive future. And she uses this phrase, the distractions of plans, that the moment up in the clouds releases her from the distraction of plans, refers to all their sort of meticulous work to try and plan the economy. So and something is therefore really changing in an interesting way in this novel, which is Miriam's attitude to the future. I think it suddenly became a different kind of future book for me. Because it's also a moment when she loses faith in that sort of planned future and sees that form of thinking about the future as a distraction, which is partly to do with her bidding farewell to hypo, I think. There's another fascinating passage, page 361, where she's getting annoyed at the way hypo can't understand why people aren't converted to his plan for the future. And there's a very tortuous and rather ambiguous 15-line sentence in which she pictures his readers as being misled by his scientific metaphors into what she says is believing themselves satisfied with the picture of humanity travelling, a procession of dying invalids towards the ultimate extinction of all that is, or at best towards a larger, better equipped death chamber, which is a very gruesome vision. And I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. I mean, it's not quite clear where it's come from immediately. But it certainly conjures up a vision of Wells's time machine, in which the time traveller is always travelling and eventually witnesses the end of life on Earth in a rather similar scene. But then she lightens the terror of that death chamber, not just with a joke about it having better equipment, but by saying, and this is the best bit, I think, that it was an abode which he so amazingly failed to see would be, for those inhabiting it, as much a matter of course as that in which their ancestors had suffered and been extinguished. So in other words, you know, the futurologists like Wells, who got so excited about the new shiny future with all these flying machines and cars and you know, other technologies, sort of didn't realize that people would just take all that for granted when it arrived. It would just be the norm, you know, nothing special. Very funny diagnosis, I think, of the sort of intoxication of that view of the future.
Well, there's a lot going on in that sentence, isn't there? I mean, just the idea of, you know, the fact that within 10 years of this book coming out, there would be thousands being sent to death camps. I'm sure Richardson didn't foresee that, but, you know, it's still very much an anti-progress kind of view of things. And then the other thing, it reminded me of David Foster Wallace's, I guess, graduation talk, or commencement speak, This is Water, which is essentially that, you know, fish don't notice that they're swimming.
Yeah, that's right.
One thing I loved that started this chapter off, which I mean, this is kind of her chopping hypo time, where he says, you know, dearest Miretta, I don't perhaps catch your drift. And then she says, trying to recall the drift of her letter. It's just like, you really don't get me at all. I mean, I just thought it was just very, but then she keeps saying it's largely her own fault. Remember, that he should assume this information to be a sufficient gift of himself, enough to feed her interest and to hold her turned his way, was largely her own fault. And, and it was her fault that she is playing him false, and that she's not buying the whole death chamber socialist future. I think she's having, and vanity, I think she's having a little, I don't know, a lover's tiff in her head. Sort of. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I mean, this does end up with, I mean, the chapter ends with a kind of huge argument with him, doesn't it? And it's sort of bubbling up now. I think that's right, but there is something that there's a kind of undertow to it, isn't there? And I think that death chamber image is part of that story, because towards the end of the book, that note of morbidity sort of overshadows the ecstasy, doesn't it, that we've seen in the clouds passage. I mean, I think the bit I just read out is about Miriam deciding that the future she wants isn't the kind of Lycurgan planned future, but it's the ecstatic cloud-based one, you know, that she can get through writing and sort of immersing herself in herself rather than in social plans. But the morbidity comes across with great subtlety, I think. And although the death chamber image may seem to jump out as in excess and surprising, we then learn that Miriam's sister, Sarah, is ill, possibly fatally. She's very anxious about her, not least because the prospect of her possible death brings back the trauma of their mother's suicide. And she goes to see her old suitor, Densley, the doctor, to enlist his help, which he's happy to give. But then he rather, again, you know, for us, rather surprisingly, I think, asks Miriam, how have you managed to get so pulled down? And, you know, when I first read that, I thought, what, you know, what's happened? And he describes her seriously run down condition, which he attributes to her burning the candle at both ends and suggests a rest cure. So we might think, she's just worried to exhaustion about Sarah, or, you know, dwelling on the past. And then she comes out with this curious retort, where she says, and after his suggestion of a rest cure, she replies by saying, and only the other day I read somewhere that big neurologist, I forget his name, the one who's always sending people to rest cures, had himself broken down and gone into a nursing home to take his own cure. So if anything, that might suggest that she doesn't take neurology and rest cures very seriously, except it is a bit disturbing. But then there's an odder moment when she goes to visit Sarah, who's convalescing now after the operation that Densley's arranged for her. And a couple of childhood friends, the Babington sisters, appear, or sorry, they're already there visiting her, visiting Sarah. And Sarah says of Miriam in front of her to the Babingtons, she's had a nervous breakdown. And again, I think for a lot of readers, that moment is probably a has she, when did that happen? Sort of thought. But certainly being pulled down, as Densley describes it, is the opposite to feeling high in the sky, as she was in the earlier chapter. Rather, as we might say, we're feeling low or depressed. But a breakdown. Miriam herself seems a bit surprised by the statement, but then we gather that it's something she has said to Sarah to explain why she was going away, but is a bit taken aback to have the phrase used about her to others. But then she's reassured that they seem rather impressed by it. So Richardson writes, she decided that whatever a nervous breakdown might or might not be, it would henceforth serve as a useful answer to demands for specific explanation.
Well, so, I wanted to throw in a note that, this was kind of the high point of the wave of what was known as neurasthenia, which was basically nervous exhaustion. It was a label that was used quite frequently as a diagnosis, particularly for intellectuals and upper class people. So it probably had a certain cachet of acceptability that, neurasthenics were essentially people too sensitive. There's a song by somebody called "I'm Too Sensitive for This World," but,
yeah, no, absolutely.
There's a certain aspect of that. And I that's why I loved when Miriam was saying, oh, well, this is a useful excuse, rather than explaining I'm going away to kind of decide what I want to do with my life, which we could see in the society of that time, that a lot of people would say, well, obviously the right choice is, like hypo, you need to get married and have children. This is straightforward and self-explanatory. Whereas she's kind of saying, I've got to go off and, I've got to have some time to think for myself. So if I explain it as neurasthenia, everybody will accept it.
No, that's right. If she were better off, she'd have been packed off to a wonderful nerve cure resort in Baden-Baden or somewhere. Sorry, I interrupted someone. What were you going to say?
There are a couple of physical things that occur. She has, in fact, miscarried during this chapter, and she alludes to the fact that she is indeed burning the candle at both ends, that when Amabel is put in jail, she is then able to sleep at night, whereas before Amabel would keep her awake all night talking. And those two things may in fact exact a physical toll on her that Densley may in fact be keying in on as well. I took that discussion about, oh yes, she had a nervous breakdown, as her latching onto that just because it was a convenient thing to excuse what was going on. And in fact, she might see both of those things as her own fault, right? Her own fault that she got pregnant in the first place, her own fault that she doesn't go to sleep when she should, etc. And so to latch on another excuse and then get rid of it and put it aside would be convenient.
Yes, I mean, Mikey just asked in the chat, do we know she had a miscarriage and not an abortion? And that was precisely what the question I was going to raise. I mean, I think, I mean, it's very curious, this, isn't it? Because as Becky says, it's never made clear. It's made slightly clear, I mean, relatively clear, I suppose, that she's pregnant. There are several clues yes, along those lines, particularly in the argument with Hypo, who is sort of, you know, she gets very angry with him that he is thinking of her pregnancy as in some way fulfilling her female destiny, and the fact that he can only see her as a mother to be is part of the problem or the cause of the argument and the parting from him. But there's very little sort of concrete evidence about her losing the child. We just, I mean, you know, there is no child in the end, so we have to assume that happened. There are a few hints. There are phrases like her untenanted body, which probably, you know, one could read that as metaphorical in some other way, but in retrospect, that probably is what it refers to. And her recently restored freedom, which George Thompson says is the other evidence for what he too thinks is a miscarriage. But I did wonder about the abortion thing, because partly, I mean, what one question I have here is that the nervous breakdown idea. I agree with what you're saying, that it could just be a sort of, it could just be exhaustion. It could be quite a physical thing. But she has had quite a bit of trauma in her past, with her mother committing suicide, the financial sort of ruin of the family, the other sister who dies, now Sarah being ill. So even without, you know, a pregnancy and a miscarriage or abortion, things are bad enough. But if she has also had one or other of those, the psychological toll could be enough to tip her over. And particularly if it was an abortion and she was feeling guilty about it, which I think might be what's going on here. I mean, I think that, you know, it did, that's what that phrase about the death chamber made me wonder about. I mean, the feeling that, because that, I mean, Ford has a passage in Parade's End where, from talking about the period in sort of just before the war, 1911 or 13, I think, where he's reading something in the paper about death chambers for unwanted children. You know, so it was kind of part of the discourse of eugenics and you know, sort of birth control.
Right.
And so
I noticed in the chat, Julia, your comment about it, nervous breakdown being a euphemism. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes. I mean, that anecdotally, I can say from my own family that's that there are people in my family who are referred to as having nervous breakdowns when what they'd actually had was a miscarriage, and the subsequent sort of physical and mental dealing with that. But it was not unusual in the entertainment, at least in the US, for people to refer to women actors having to leave a production because of a nervous breakdown, and that often, you know, was later found to be an unplanned pregnancy that ended in miscarriage or abortion.
Yes, no, and it could be a good alibi for just going out of the public sort of sphere for a while you were having a child, if that's what you were doing.
Yes, and being in a nursing home or other medical facility. Yeah.
Interesting. And I think, I mean, I just want to say about the abortion theory that Rosamund Lehmann's novel of 1936, the year after this one, tells a comparable story about the protagonist Olivia Curtis, who has an affair with a married man and gets pregnant. And that was a scandalous book for its frankness about her abortion, which was still illegal in 1935 or 6, and was maybe a little easier to get then than in 1907 when this novel is set. But I think the tone of what's happening here, those comments like the bit about the death chamber and better equipment and so on, does make me wonder whether we're not supposed to think that was what happened to Miriam, and indeed perhaps also Richardson, because I think we don't know her story other than from whatever evidence there is in the novel, which is very ambiguous.
There's a section where and I don't have the page right here, but one of the places where she talks about this feeling about women being only, you know, their fate is to have children. Page before and a page before that, she mentions surgical procedure, surgical operation, surgical procedure. And then she goes into this discussion. And that's the first time it made me think, I wonder if she's talking about an abortion rather than a miscarriage.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, and I think that's right. And I suppose, I mean, you know, if anyone would have known how to go about getting these things, H.G. Wells would have been your man, wouldn't he?
I don't think he would have supported it, would he? He would think that maternity was the solution to everything. But you know, it's possible that those things weren't as, it's possible that we don't know how difficult it would have been to obtain one in 1907.
I do think, I know Leslie Hall is one of the scholars who's done quite a lot of work into, you know, the availability and the attitudes towards abortion and birth control at the time. I mean, it was illegal. In some ways, it was probably easier to get at that time than actually in the 30s, simply because the awareness and kind of the professional enforcement standards had strengthened considerably after the First World War.
I think there are a couple of other episodes in the book that I wanted to ask you about, and it's what and they're both really to do with Amabel. One of the sort of main events in the earlier sections of this novel is when Miriam is talking to Amabel and suddenly has a sort of vision of introducing her to Michael, as if she hasn't thought of it before. And she's quite shocked by this thought. I mean, it just sort of materializes in front of her. I mean, again, it's a little sort of mystical almost. And then she sort of feels she ought to put away the image, but it sort of works for her. And then she realizes that she wants this, and she does introduce them. And of course, Amabel is very sort of very taken by Michael and says, "Oh, he's so beautiful, and you know, you should marry him." And Miriam's response to her is, "Marry him yourself, then." Which, you know, is a little hard to read the first time round, but it becomes clear as the book goes on that she means that. I mean, that that actually the significance of this image is, you know, that it seems like a solution for her in some ways if the two people she's most involved with at the time, or has been most involved with, Michael and Amabel, get together. And that's quite
a bit of a balancing act in the sense of it takes a bilateral relationship, and suddenly it, you know, particularly because she has, as has been mentioned, her Amabel has been quite demanding of her time and energy and attention, that she can just, you know, keep an acquaintance, but know that somebody else is being kept up to the wee hours with her conversations.
That's right. I mean, it's odd, isn't it? Because you know, I think the first thought is that solves the Michael problem. You know, that she's feeling guilty about having to suffer on his behalf because she's, you know, he's obviously still has very strong feelings for her, and she's abandoned him, you know, as a lover, not as a friend. But then it becomes clear to her that what this image of the two together means is that she actually wants to leave Amabel as well, and she hadn't realized that before. And then she starts thinking about the casket of letters that Amabel had broken, and did she read the letters first? And you know, that's typical of how what a whirlwind she is in Miriam's life. But it is, you know, it's not immediately clear, I think, why she feels she needs that relationship to end. I mean, you know, there are presumably ways of getting a bit more sleep other than ending a relationship.
Well, the business with the you know, the casket, which is such a, I mean, I don't know how widely that or freely that word was used in the context of what we would consider just a box, but you know, it from a metaphorical standpoint, it seems to be a very powerful image that somebody has broken into, you know, this correspondence. It seems more than just, it's not just an accident, is it?
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I want to get back to the Michael Amabel thing for a second, because there's a scene when she and Michael are sitting next to each other, and Michael puts his hand in her, starts to put his hand in her hand, and then someone comes along who needs to get back in the row so that they have to stand up and separate. And then that passage, and this is page, oh, what page is it? Well, anyway, it is, to me, it was just one of those, well, it wasn't one long sentence, but it was a very convoluted series of sentences. And it's describing this person, this woman, the lonely middle-aged girl who had just gone by. And it's almost like it's the anti-Miriam. It's like everything she wouldn't want to be. And I think she's afraid that if she starts going into these relationships that are sort of from the outside world looking in, saying, oh, that makes sense. You know, he's a handsome young man and he's witty and or Densley is an up and coming doc, that she's afraid she's going to become this thing that she's so afraid of being. And this woman is described as squeezing apologetically by 2/3 of the way through a life that had been a ceaseless stream of events set in a ceaseless stream of inadequate commentary without and within. The motionless, unchanging, incommunicable experience announced its claims without achieving freedom from its hunger. And it goes on like that. So to me, that was Miriam saying, this is what I don't want to be. And I think, to me, that explains a lot of her decisions in this book.
I just want to bring attention to a couple of comments in the chat that I think are very relevant. Scott McCracken points out that Miriam is often the third party in a triangle. If you look at her relationship with Alma and Hypel Wilson as an example, and then the Amabel Michael relationship, Scott's comment is she likes in-betweenness, which, you know, in a larger sense, that is much of what Miriam's finding her place in the world is, saying, I don't fit neatly into this, you know, I'm not a round peg fitting in a round hole or a square peg in a square hole. I'm in between. And this is an example of how she can kind of find a place. I have a relationship with these two people, but it's not the marital relationship, or it's not the traditional male-female relationship.
Yes, and also she finds a kind of freedom and liberation in not being a round peg fitting into a round hole. But it feels like pilgrimage is her journey to realize that. So she's kind of wrestling with, should I be a round peg fitting into a round hole? Can I find the right round hole to fit into? And there's somewhere in this book, which I can't locate at the moment, where she sort of realizes that actually she's now freed from that. And that's where the writing takes over. So finding her voice, being comfortable as a writer, where she starts talking about the language and the way she writes. That it feels like a breakthrough. And the clear horizon is like clearing out all of these possible futures which are cluttering her vision. And she can only become herself as a writer, as a person, when she clears all that stuff out. So this book is really, I think it's quite exciting, the way she's kind of addressing each of these key people who's been so important and formative. And now she's going away for this 6 months to do whatever the next piece of work is.
Yeah, no, that's really nicely put.
I think that's an excellent point. And Karen as well, I really liked your point in the chat that about the pictured future, because that's how I read this Amabel and Michael scene. This idea that she's arranging them as a kind of artwork or a kind of, tableau. And it's a beautiful tableau. Look at these two beautiful people. Isn't it right that they're together? Because there's so much emphasis on beauty there, isn't there? And so much emphasis on them looking right together.
Yes.
Use the word arranged, like she arranges them in her mind and kind of puts them together and then brackets them off. And that's the ways that she moves on from both of them. By turning them into art. I can't remember, Scott might remember, there's a letter from Amabel to either Gloria or George Thompson, I can't remember, in which she's quite bitter about this. And she says something along the lines of, we had to be sacrificed to Dorothy's art. They maybe not at the time, but maybe later when they reflected on it, they thought, okay, we have been arranged. We have been in this situation, and maybe we didn't want to. And this was all about Dorothy, actually, which, when you see that letter and how bitter it is, it's very difficult to read this scene neutrally, I think.
And there's that image of the beady eyes of Michael's children, which I just find that so powerful and so kind of, I don't know, there's a real ambivalence in there. She's kind of excited and fascinated, but beady eyes is a quite repulsive to some degree. It's a kind of off-putting image that I don't know what other people think.
By the time that she was writing this book, Benjamin and Veronica were married and they had a son that Richardson knew, right? So I don't know if he had beady eyes, but
yeah, David Brad.
Yeah.
Is it possible she meant something not offensive by beady? Maybe she meant bright, shiny?
Yeah. Well, she thrills. That's the phrase about thrilling to the pictured future comes just after she talks about the beady eyes. So, yeah, maybe.
It could just be a very sort of unsentimental picture of a certain kind of child's look, couldn't it?
She's not fond of children.
Yes.
No, that's right.
Although there's more discussion of children in this. She talks about, she really notices Sissy Bailey at one point early on and realizes the transition that she's gone through. She talks about her niece, who's growing up in this uncivilized world of America and Cuba, she stayed friends with the Broom sisters too. So, she had some connections to children that she was happy with. I just wanted to mention, obviously people have said another triangle that exists in the book is the Mag, Jan, Miriam triangle. It's not as frequent, but it's certainly an interesting, juxtaposition of two people who are living, two women who are living together. I assume they're living together, at least they're together all the time. And then Miriam comes in and out of that relationship.
Well, one suggestion I wanted to make, I think what Scott says about the ménage à trois sort of pattern or triangle pattern is absolutely true. Though she's always leaving them, isn't she, as well? That she wants to be both in and out, not just of single relationships, but of triangular ones. And it did make me wonder whether the clear horizon idea is partly about clearing herself out of other people's horizons, not just clearing them out of hers. So that the more benign way of thinking about her arranging Michael and Amabel would be to kind of get out of their lives and let them have their own, rather than be stuck in a sort of unpromising future with her, because she feels she can't commit to either of them as they might want.
I do want to mention the point that just a factual tie-in to this, and Scott brought it up in our Lost Ladies of Lit discussion, that in the 1911 census, Dorothy Richardson, Veronica Leslie Jones, and Benjamin Grad are all shown at the same address, as residents of the same address.
Mm.
I'm just wondering that I suddenly, when I mentioned earlier how I felt as if she was really kind of getting her writing wings going, and how I really thought that she had many more books in her, but now I'm starting to think maybe she did too good a job of clearing the horizon and didn't have anything else to write about.
Well, I will say, and obviously Scott knows much more about this than I, but if you know Richardson's biography, she was facing increasing practical, the demands on her time and energy, drawing her away from work on the book, were increasing throughout this period. So just the process of being able to have time to write was something that intruded more and more into progress in the work.
Right.
Could I just ask, before we run out of time, about one other scene which I found very difficult to read, really. It was the one I felt least secure about, I think, which is when Miriam visits Amabel in prison. And I just was very curious to hear what people thought about that scene. It's partly been contextualized by some of the things we've said about the fact that she's already effectively made the decision to leave her, but it's still, there's something very strange going on in that episode, I think, that I'm not convinced I've quite grasped, and I wonder what others
it was
thought.
very, very unnerving the way she describes what Annabelle looks like in her prison garb, and of course Dorothy / Miriam is very conscious of clothing, but it made her look like a transforming gown. The firm pillar of her neck supported a face whose pure oval, usually outlined by the silky dark curtains, was broken by the emergence of a small cliff of white brow. I just felt as if Amabel had just undergone some horrible transformation. And so I don't know if that's true or whether it's Miriam's perception of her.
Well, it was, and this is where the timing becomes a dicey issue, because there was a period where the suffragette marchers and protesters were being imprisoned and were going on hunger strikes and being forced fed.
Right.
And it was actually the force feeding that led to, actually the popular reaction against the image of women being force fed, tubes inserted through their noses and down their esophagus. That led to, that was one of the factors in essentially opening up or lightening up the repression of the suffragette movement. Now, where it gets dicey is, and I don't think Thompson touches on this at all, is whether that was going on because Richardson has essentially shifted an event that took place for the actual Amabel, has shifted it forward a year. I am not enough of a suffragette expert to know whether or not that's going on, but all accounts were that the imprisonment of the suffragettes, which weren't, they didn't get long sentences, but it seems to have been really brutal treatment that they experienced. That was physically, it was mentally and physically torturous to them.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. There's something very histrionic about Amabel's behavior there, isn't there? That she's sort of, embodying abjection in front of the wardress.
That's the lines, and why all this drama, and why in the presence of the wardress this tragic martyred air.
Yeah, and then she catches Miriam's eye and they laugh, it says. It's not clear whether it's an out loud laugh or a sort of inner laugh, but quite hard to read what the dynamics are in there, I think.
I mean, do people think this is the volume where Miriam is moving away from a kind of commitment to public political action? I mean, she's been a very vocal socialist and feminist up until this point, and I suspect this is the moment where she decides to commit to art. And so maybe part of what's going on there in the relationship with Amabel is a kind of guilt about the fact that she's decided not to participate in the action and has chosen another path. And therefore she has to somehow see Amabel as, I don't know, abject, as a way of dealing with that herself.
Well, that's one of the things that she's rejecting, isn't it? I mean, she's rejecting the idea of putting herself in a traditional marital relationship. She's rejecting the Monday through Friday work of going to the office, working in the dental practice. She's rejecting the activities, the lysergens that she's been involved with. So it is a casting off of a lot of ties that's going on.
Do you think there's also a sense in there that Amabel is angry that she's taken so long to come and visit? I mean, we don't know how long it's taken, but there is something in that exchange about sort of offering her a piece of rope to hang her with, isn't there? Which is again sort of slightly strange or unexpected.
I may be the only person who read this scene with Amabel as being, it sounds like I'm the only person. I thought Amabel was playing this up big time, that it was a huge dramatic opportunity for her, and not necessarily that she was under duress, actual duress, but she was making it seem so, and that Miriam keyed in on that. At a certain point, Miriam sees that. Right at the end, there's a look from Amabel that makes me think, oh yeah, this is all acting. And I soured on Amabel early on, but this just reinforced that. And did anyone else see her that way? Oh, thank goodness. I see some people nodding, because it was just, I just thought, this woman, she definitely needs to be out of Miriam's life because, oh gosh. And I was completely offended by her reading the letters, and I mean, no boundaries whatsoever. Oh my God, she needed out of that place fast. And so 6 months abroad, yay, go Miriam, get out of there. These people are toxic. Unbelievable.
I have to say, partly because some months ago I read a suffragette memoir, and I can't for the life of me at the moment remember the title. It was the woman who slashed the Rokeby Venus, actually. So it was quite notorious suffragette. But I go back to the point that, for most of them, even though their prison sentences were brief, they were brutal. They were physically, so Amabel might have been playing something up, but, I think also remember, I mean, maybe less for Amabel because she's already had the experience of living abroad and being in a somewhat contentious relationship, an affair with this married man, and we assume he's married anyway. I assume he's married. But I think for most of the suffragettes, in terms of their background, it was a really, shocking experience for them to be imprisoned and to be treated that way. I mean, there was a real sense among the, the justice establishment in England that this was a way to get these, uppity women to shut up and go back into their place.
I can see that, but I still say Amabel was playing it up.
Okay.
It was, yeah. We can agree to disagree here.
Okay.
Well,
I also think Miriam, if there's a line at the bottom of 311, where she's talking about how Amabel held her head steadily upright like an Englishwoman and assumed an expression perfectly conveying the brooding, provisional graciousness of the kind of Englishwoman who is always alert to ignore everything to which this graciousness does not apply. I mean, she also knows that Amabel's going to go back to a perfectly comfortable existence, right? Whereas Richardson would have nowhere to go except going to scrap for, a few shillings a week and hope that she could save a few pounds to go to the seaside. So I agree. I think the scales are falling from Miriam's eyes as far as Amabel goes, and rightly so.
Well, yeah, she does picture Amabel essentially recuperating in her mother's, in the garden of her mother's house.
Right.
Comfort of that situation. Yeah.
Yes. And she thinks she has seen that Amabel is, she comes from money, and that makes a big difference to Miriam. Mm-hmm. And that money may, in fact, make her prison stay a little more pleasant. We don't know. We're not told. And I'm reading way too far off the page. I grant you that. Obviously, my feelings toward Amabel are bleeding through here.
Very interesting.
I keep thinking about that woman reading her letters. And that was just like, it's a primal thing for me. I cannot believe that this woman would invade another woman's privacy to that point. And that Miriam would so uncharacteristically hide that casket from herself, that she would hide all of her feelings about this in order to maintain the relationship. Miriam is not a person to lie to herself, and yet she does in this instance. She tells herself stories to keep from looking at the actual Amabel, which is unfortunate because she could have gotten shut of this woman way earlier, before the letter reading.
Mm.
Well, and also let's remember, Amabel has invaded her space repeatedly. I mean, she invaded her space at Tansley Street or Flaxman Square, where she went in and wrote, I love you on the mirror. Right. And now we have proof that she's gone into, yes, note from Becky about Joe winning about the casket as a genital in a Freudian sense. Lord, I mean, if you want to go for the Freudian interpretations, there's a whole, I mean, this book is rich with them. I'm not personally sure they're all there. One other thing I wanted to mention while we're all together here was, I think one of the best comic scenes in the whole book is the scene where Hypo and Miriam are walking after leaving the cafe, and he is doggedly trying to figure out where she lives, and she's persistently like, well, okay, let's say goodbye here.
Yeah, and there's nowhere, she says.
She is not gonna let him know, and it's such a personal issue for her of having that independence of, I have a place to live and you don't know where it is a source of power. It's a source of autonomy, but just, I mean, Richardson doesn't normally do that sort of thing, of these kind of extended scenes where you see this interaction playing out over, as they're walking along, going on like that. Norma, I mean, she's much more into set scenes.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I remember laughing at that the first time, and I enjoyed it even more knowing it was coming up this time around.
It was funny.
Well, we've gone past the hour, and great conversation today. Does anyone have anything else they'd like to bring up while we've got Max here? We also have some other great Richardson experts here. Becky Bowler and Scott McCracken are with us. So if there's any questions or issues that you'd like to bring up, this is a great time to do it. Just feel free to speak up and throw anything in if you'd like.
I'd quite like to ask Max about what model of the future he thinks Richardson is working with, or just say a little bit about the future in pilgrimage.
Well, it does change, I think. I mean, that's partly what I was suggesting is happening here, that this is, you know, very much as you said, that this is the moment where she loses faith in the Lycurgans, isn't it, and everything they represent, and that is a certain model of the future. I think, I mean, what I've been very struck, I sort of apologize for going on about this in a way because it's come up in several of the discussions so far, but I'm just very struck by how much she writes about the future, how it comes into so many paragraphs, so many pages, and of course the whole book in a way is about what her future is going to be, but it's so different from all of those you know, 18th century and 19th century kind of young woman entering society, you know, novels where the future is marriage, and that's pretty much the central question. For her, the question is what else? What alternatives? And the Lycurgans offer one, you know, in a way, all the different people we've spoken about offer different possible futures for her, and she's trying out different ones. You know, is it going to be the world of work? Is it going to be writing? Is it going to be love of different kinds? And you know, to teaching, whatever. And obviously she's gravitating towards writing. But I think it's an odd kind of, I mean, you know, I take it one of the things that's happening is she's reading Proust as she's writing the sequence, and that's partly why this notion of the future is changing. I mean, I think that bit about the loop of time that comes in this book sounds very Proustian, and as if it's beginning to become clear that it is that kind of time loop sort of book that À la Recherche is as well. So I don't think I've yet got a sort of a good definition of a single view of the future that she has, partly because I'm not sure she has a single one, but I do think it's an evolving one, but it is the big question for her. That's really what I'm trying to say. And it partly comes out, presumably, out of being around people like Wells who are talking about the future all the time, but she takes it to mean something very different from what they're interested in. And it's a much more personal, sort of introspective, you know, psychological future, if you like, rather than a social or political one.
Scott, while we've got you here, we have a question in the chat that you can probably answer, which is, any idea when volume 5 of the Oxford or any of the additional volumes of if you can give us a forecast of what's coming in that wonderful project?
Well, the next volume will be the first volume of the letters, and after that, the next volume of the fiction will be coming out. So don't hold your breath, is what I would say. Sorry.
Well, I mean, Dorothy Richardson took decades to produce her work, so it's not inexcusable that it takes a decade or two to get the authoritative edition of her works out too. Just one other comment or question about the time that this is being set. I mean, earlier we said, you know, Miriam doesn't talk about what she's writing, but was she not was not Dorothy Richardson working on her Quaker books at this time, or starting it, or is that essentially into the next volume?
It's a little bit. It's just a little bit before the Quaker work. It's when she's still writing for the sort of anarchist publication, okay. Which has various titles. But there's quite an interesting article around this time, 1906, 1907, where she, instead of writing a book review, she instead starts to write about experience in a much more kind of creative way, I think. And then she starts doing the middles that Hypo suggests she writes for the Saturday Review. So this is definitely the moment biographically, if we want to do the Thompson thing, when she starts to think of herself as a writer, a creative writer, broadly speaking, rather than a political and social writer or a journalist.
So even the substance of what she's writing is starting to shift at this point. Well, that's good to know. Any other questions or comments that folks want to make before we wrap up? Well, if not, thank you. This has been a terrific discussion. It's amazing how much we can get out of what is actually one of the shorter books in the whole series. But I think as we've gone through, we come to appreciate so much more. And I have to say, this is, for me, the rereading is so much richer than the reading in the first time around. So I look forward to doing it again sometime in the future. So if not, I just want to thank Max for taking the time to talk to us and offer thoughts. A great discussion, and thank you all for taking part. We'll be getting together again at the end of November to be talking about our next book, Dimple Hill, which is a very big change of pace in terms of setting and kind of focus for Miriam. So if you haven't started, it will be a breath of fresh air in a literal sense. So thank you all, and I'll be letting everybody know when this is available on YouTube. And let's keep on reading. Take care, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, Max.
Great pleasure.